So imagine going to a doctor with a broken arm. You point to the swelling and you say, it hurts here.
Right.
And the doctor doesn't pull out an x-ray machine. Instead, they just sort of sit back in their chair, look you in the eye, and ask, does your arm actually want to be broken?
Which is, I mean, that's just a completely wild thing to hear from a doctor.
It sounds absurd, right? But the second you step out of physical medicine and into the world of human psychology, that x-ray machine is completely useless. You're no longer looking at clean, jagged white lines on a black background.
Exactly. You're completely flying blind in a lot of ways.
Right. Welcome to the murky, chaotic, and just utterly fascinating diagnostic borders of the human mind.
It really is a profound shift in perspective. Because physical medicine is, largely binary. It's broken or it's not broken. It's infected or it's clean.
Yeah, and we crave that certainty. We want the easy fix.
We do. But mapping human psychology requires wading into this landscape where the symptoms are literally woven into the fabric of a person's identity. And the clinical material we are diving into today, it tracks how therapists over the last century realized that humans absolutely refuse to fit into neat little boxes.
And that is today's mission. You and I are going to move way past that outdated binary of sane versus insane.
Right.
We are unpacking a deep clinical history of psychoanalysis to really understand how mental health professionals learn to categorize human suffering. It is a wild journey, and by the end of this deep dive, you are going to completely rethink personality quirks, what it means to be functional, and how the brain processes fear and connection.
It's going to flip a lot of what people think they know completely upside down.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand where we are today, we have to look at a massive realization that hit the psychiatric community back in, I think it was 1933.
Yeah, 1933.
Right. A psychoanalyst named Wilhelm Reich noticed that stamping the word neurotic on every patient's file just, it wasn't working anymore.
It really wasn't. The clinical reality was demanding a lot more nuance. Early therapists were looking at their waiting rooms and seeing two completely different types of suffering.
Okay, how so?
Well, on one hand, you had patients coming in with a very discrete, specific problem. They functioned fine in 90% of their life, but they had an intense fear of dogs, or maybe a sudden unexplained panic when speaking in public.
Like a localized issue.
Precisely. And Reich called this a symptom neurosis.
Okay, that makes sense. A specific symptom.
But then you had a second group. And these patients didn't have one isolated phobia. Their entire way of moving through the world, their relationships, their work habits, just their baseline personality, it was all permeated by neurotic patterns.
Wow, so it's everywhere.
Right. Reich called this a character neurosis. The problem wasn't a localized symptom. The problem was the character structure itself.
So how did they even tell them apart?
To figure out which one they were dealing with, therapists developed this diagnostic sieve made of 5 specific clinical questions.
Let's walk through those because they reveal so much about how the mind, hides things from us. First, they ask about the timeline, right? Is there a specific trigger you can point to, or has this issue been hovering around for as long as you can remember?
Yeah, exactly. And second is the onset. Was there a sudden dramatic spike in your anxiety or just a gradual creeping worsening of your daily baseline?
Right. And the third one is actually my favorite. Did you come to therapy on your own or did someone else force you to be here?
That third question is incredibly telling. A patient with a symptom neurosis usually walks into the clinic voluntarily because the symptom is distressing them. They hate it.
But the character neurosis patient?
A patient with a character neurosis is often dragged in by a frustrated spouse, a burned-out boss, or, a court order.
Wow.
And that leads directly into the core of the issue, which is the fourth question. Are the symptoms ego-alien or ego-syntonic?
Okay, we need to define those because those terms sound like, science fiction, but they are crucial.
They do sound a bit sci-fi. So ego-alien means the patient looks at their own behavior and feels alienated from it. They say, I know it is irrational to be terrified of elevators. I hate that I do this.
So the symptom feels like a foreign invader.
Exactly. Ego-syntonic, on the other hand, means the behavior is completely in sync with the patient's self-image. If you point out their toxic or destructive pattern, they look at you like you are crazy and say, what do you mean? This is just the way I am.
This is the only logical way to survive.
Right, which dictates the final question. Can the patient form an observing ego? Basically, can they team up with the therapist to objectively look at the problem?
Or do they view the therapist as an attacker trying to, destroy their personality? Or maybe a magical rescuer who is supposed to fix their life without them lifting a finger?
Yeah, if you can sit down with the patient and both look at the problem as a shared enemy, you have a symptom neurosis.
Yeah, if they don't.
What's fascinating here is, if the patient views you as the enemy because you are questioning their fundamental reality, you have a character neurosis.
So is a symptom neurosis sort of like catching a bad flu? It's an outside invader, it makes you feel awful, you want it gone, and you know it's not you.
That's a great way to look at it.
Whereas a character neurosis is more like an underlying autoimmune condition. Your own system's baseline, the very thing that is supposed to protect you, is actually the mechanism causing the distress.
Yes. And taking that autoimmune analogy a step further, with the flu, your immune system fights the virus. In an autoimmune condition, your system fights the treatment because it thinks the treatment is a threat,
Oh, wow.
which is the exact roadblock therapists hit. If a patient genuinely believes their destructive behavior is just who they are, if it is entirely egocentric, treating them requires a completely different approach.
Because the challenge of egocentric behavior isn't just, a theoretical puzzle. It becomes a massive practical roadblock the second that person sits down on a therapist's couch. This really dismantles the Hollywood version of therapy, doesn't it?
Completely. I mean, we are culturally conditioned by movies to expect shock trauma therapy.
Like an old Hitchcock film.
Exactly, like Spellbound. The patient lies on the couch, the music swells, they suddenly remember the one time they were locked in a closet at age 5, they burst into tears, and instantly they are cured of all their adult problems.
It's the cinematic equivalent of popping a dislocated shoulder back into place.
Yeah.
Fast, dramatic, fixed.
But that is clinical fiction. While symptom neuroses can sometimes be resolved relatively quickly by finding an unconscious conflict and processing it, character neuroses are born from strain trauma.
Strain trauma, not shock trauma.
Right. They aren't created by one dramatic, repressed memory. They're formed through years and years of prosaic, everyday patterns of learning, subtle reinforcement, and survival adaptations.
Just everyday life grinding them into shape.
Yeah. And because of that, the therapist's very first arduous goal is taking something that is egocentric and making it ego-alien.
You have to convince the person that their lifelong survival strategy is actually the thing killing them. And there's a story in the research material about a 30-year-old accountant that illustrates this perfectly. Set the scene for us, because this guy sounds exhaustingly intense.
Oh, he was. He was a highly driven, intensely successful professional.
Hmm.
He was raised to compensate for his father's failed ambitions, so his entire identity was built on outworking everyone around him.
All right.
But he eventually comes to therapy complaining of deep exhaustion and a feeling that he's, missing out on his young children's lives.
But his approach to fixing his exhaustion is wild.
It's incredible. He brings the therapist a highly regimented, color-coded, minute-by-minute schedule for relaxing.
Wait, a schedule for relaxing?
Yes, he wanted to rigidly map out his volunteer work, his television time, his cooking, and even scheduled times for making love to his wife.
He is using the exact same frantic, obsessive machinery that caused his burnout to try and cure his burnout.
Exactly. The solution was the disease. If the therapist had just helped him implement that schedule, they would have been reinforcing the character neurosis.
So what did the therapist have to do?
The monumental task was to show this accountant that he needed to learn how to simply be rather than constantly do. But for someone whose entire self-worth is ego-syntonically linked to productivity, stopping the doing feels like annihilation. It feels like dying.
I have to admit, I get stuck on something here. When you describe it like that, it sounds like an epic, life-altering battle of the soul. But the clinical literature describes treating a character neurosis as less exciting, less surprising, and less dramatic than treating a symptom.
It does.
It says both the patient and the therapist have to deal with intense boredom and demoralization. Why is unwinding someone's core identity boring?
Well, think about how habits are formed. You don't build a lifelong character structure in an afternoon. You build it through millions of microscopic repetitive actions over decades.
Okay, yeah.
Unwinding it requires the painstaking repetitive unraveling of all those tiny threads. There are no swelling violins or dramatic breakthroughs. It is unglamorous, grueling work.
It's like untangling a massive knot of Christmas lights.
Exactly. Furthermore, the therapist has to build a working alliance. When you challenge an egocentric trait, the patient's identity feels assaulted. They will naturally distrust you, fight you, or try to outsmart you.
Which takes forever to get past.
With severe character issues, just establishing enough trust to begin the actual therapeutic work can take over a year of repetitive, frustrating sessions.
Wow. Okay, so mapping out this difference between symptom and character was a massive leap forward. Therapists finally had a framework to distinguish between a localized issue and a systemic identity issue.
They did.
But as decades passed and clinicians saw thousands more patients, they realized this neat little diagnostic system had a fatal flaw.
It absolutely did. The old model essentially created a linear hierarchy of severity. At
Hmm.
the bottom, you had neurosis considered mild and manageable. In the middle, you had character disorders. And at the top, the most severe was psychosis, a total break from reality.
Like a one-dimensional scale?
Exactly. It was a 1D scale that assumed any character problem was inherently more pathological and damaging than any symptom problem.
Which sounds logical until you actually meet real human beings.
Precisely. Let me give you a clinical counterexample. Imagine a man suffering from profound agoraphobia. He never leaves his house. However, inside his home, he has warm relationships, he's deeply connected to his family, and he works productively from his home office.
Right.
Medically speaking, his agoraphobia is just a symptom. It's ego alien, he hates it. So under the old linear model, he is classified as merely neurotic, the least severe category.
But his actual lived reality is completely suffocating. I mean, he can't step outside his front door. Compare him to someone walking around with a mild personality disorder. Maybe they are a bit narcissistic or slightly rigid.
Right, the mild character disorder.
That person goes to work, travels, eats at restaurants, and generally lives a full life, even if they annoy everyone around them. Here's where it gets really interesting, because it's like trying to grade the severity of a car crash strictly by looking at the speedometer, completely ignoring the type of
Oh,
vehicle.
that's a perfect way to put it.
A heavily armored tank hitting a brick wall at 10 miles an hour is a completely different physical reality than a convertible with the top down hitting a brick wall at 10 miles an hour. The linear scale just didn't account for the vehicle itself.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that realization forced the psychological community to tear up the floorboards. The lines blurred entirely between a benign personality style, a severe character disorder, and full-blown psychosis.
Everything got messy.
Very messy.
Hmm.
And the text points out that even today, the modern DSM, the diagnostic manual used globally, still struggles with this.
Yeah.
It frequently equates personality disorders with severe impairment, missing the nuance that a character issue can exist at any level of intensity, from a quirky interpersonal style to a devastating, life-altering condition.
Because that one-dimensional scale broke down, therapists found themselves adrift. They had clinic waiting rooms full of patients who simply refused to fit into the neurotic box, but who clearly weren't hallucinating, so they couldn't be put in the psychotic box.
Right.
This massive gray area forced the discovery of an entirely new, deeply chaotic middle ground.
Welcome to the borderland.
It's a great name for it. Historically, clinicians were absolutely grasping for words to describe these patients. Back in 1890, a psychiatrist named Roth talked about a borderland between sanity and insanity.
Yes, and later, clinicians threw out terms like the as-if personality.
The as-if personality, what does that mean?
The as-if concept is vital to understand. These were patients who seemed to have no solid core identity. They moved through life, acting as if they felt normal emotions, mirroring the people around them to survive, but internally they felt completely hollow.
Just a shell.
Exactly. Other clinicians called it pseudoneurotic schizophrenia.
Why were they so hard to pin down? What was happening in the therapy room?
They presented an incredible paradox. They rarely had hallucinations or delusions, so you couldn't officially call them psychotic. But they completely lacked the stability, resilience, and observing ego of a neurotic patient.
So they were somewhere entirely different.
Right. In therapy, they might become temporarily convinced that the therapist was actively plotting to ruin their life, which borders on a psychotic break. But the moment they left the office, they could navigate the subway and go to their accounting job.
They functioned in society but lived in internal chaos. The clinical literature describes it as a stable instability. They were too sane to be considered crazy and too crazy to be considered sane.
That stable instability was eventually solidified by psychoanalyst Otto Kernberg as borderline personality organization.
BPO.
Yes. Kernberg didn't view borderline as a specific checklist of symptoms. He viewed it as a level of functioning, a massive plateau sitting between neurosis and psychosis. At this level, a person's identity isn't fully integrated, and they rely on primitive defense mechanisms like splitting people into all good or all bad. but they still fundamentally grasp reality.
But then the DSM gets involved in 1980 and the entire definition shifts. They didn't adopt Kernberg's broad level of functioning.
No, they didn't.
Instead, they shrunk the concept into borderline personality disorder, leaning on the work of a researcher named Gunderson. They defined it as a very specific, self-dramatizing, histrionic type of personality, someone prone to outward outbursts, self-harm, and frantic visible instability. Why did the DSM do that?
You have to look at what psychiatry was trying to achieve in the late 70s and early 80s. The field wanted to be recognized as hard medicine.
Oh, they wanted to be like the physical doctors we talked about earlier.
Exactly. To do that, they needed criteria that a doctor could reliably observe and check off on a clipboard. Histrionic behavior screaming, outward rage, visible self-harm is highly observable. It is easy to measure.
But what about the inner emptiness?
Right, internal chaotic feelings of emptiness or an as-if lack of identity? That is incredibly subjective and hard to measure for a research study.
So, by making borderline an official diagnosis in the DSM, did the psychiatric community actually accidentally erase a whole group of people who needed help just because they weren't dramatic enough?
Yes, and it is widely considered a clinical tragedy.
Right.
By narrowing the definition to the histrionic presentation, the DSM essentially erased the quiet borderline.
The quiet borderline.
These are people, often with deeply schizoid or obsessional traits, who operate at that same chaotic, unintegrated borderline level, but they turn their chaos inward. Schizoid individuals detach and isolate. Obsessional people rigidly over-control themselves. They don't act out outwardly.
But they're suffering just as much.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But because the manual defined borderline so narrowly, all the empirical research, the funding, and the clinical training over the last few decades skewed heavily toward the dramatic type. Therapists were left completely in the dark regarding how to identify and treat the quiet borderlines who suffer in silence.
That is heartbreaking. It shows how a seemingly academic shift in a manual has profound real-world consequences for someone sitting at home wondering why no one can explain what is wrong with them.
It really does.
But once clinicians finally got a grip on what this stable instability actually looked like, the obvious next frontier was figuring out where it actually comes from.
The why. Understanding the etiology.
Yeah.
And the research makes it clear that you can't point to just one thing. You have to look at childhood developmental stages, the impact of trauma, and the evolutionary biology of the brain itself.
Let's start with development, because the application of Erik Erikson's stages here blew my mind. Erikson theorized that children go through very specific interpersonal tasks as they grow. Theorists suggested that if an adult is in a psychotic state, they are essentially fixated at the very earliest stage of infancy, like the struggle of basic trust versus mistrust. They literally cannot differentiate between what is inside their own mind and what is outside in reality.
And if someone is operating at the higher neurotic level, they've successfully navigated those early survival stages. Their conflicts are more advanced.
Like what?
They are dealing with what Erikson called initiative versus guilt. These are Oedipal conflicts, internal moral struggles where they feel intense guilt over their own desires or ambitions.
But the borderline patient.
They are stuck right in the middle, in a toddler-era phase called separation individuation.
Explain how a child gets stuck there and what that actually looks like in an adult.
Think about a toddler realizing they are a separate person from their caregiver. If they wander too far away, they are struck by the terror of total abandonment. But if they are pulled too close, they feel swallowed up, terrified of enmeshment and losing their newly discovered identity.
So they're trapped between two fears.
Exactly. A borderline adult is fundamentally stuck in that exact panic, playing it out in adult relationships. If they get close to a romantic partner, they feel suffocated and push them away. But the moment the partner steps back, the traumatic fear of abandonment kicks in and they frantically pull them back.
They are constantly ping-ponging between the terror of isolation and the terror of suffocation. And researchers started figuring out why people get fixated there. By the 1990s, experts like Alan Shore and Judith Herman pointed out the undeniable massive role of trauma.
It's huge.
Specifically, severe relational trauma and childhood abuse practically wire the brain to expect betrayal from the very people who are supposed to provide safety, creating that endless borderline loop.
The environment violently disrupts the development. And that brings us to the neurobiology. Evolutionary neuroscientist Jack Panksepp mapped out ancient mammalian emotion systems in the brain.
Okay, how does that connect?
Well, psychosis activates what Panksepp calls the fear system. This is the primitive lizard brain terror of physical annihilation or being eaten by a predator. Neurosis involves higher-level cognitive structures processing unconscious guilt. but borderline pathology overwhelmingly activates the panic system.
Wait, isn't panic the same as fear?
No, the panic system is entirely different from fear. The panic system is specifically tied to separation anxiety, social bonding, and infantile attachment needs. It is the neurological alarm bell that rings when a young mammal is separated from its mother.
Oh, wow. So what does this all mean for the listener? If we strip away the clinical jargon, it's basically like a smartphone's operating system.
How so?
It's like the brain is running completely different survival apps. Psychosis is running the Run from the Tiger app. Borderline is running the Where's my mother? I am gonna die alone app. And neurosis is running the I feel intensely guilty about what I just did app.
That's a brilliant way to phrase it.
You cannot troubleshoot the guilt app if the person's brain is fundamentally locked into the abandonment app.
This raises an important question, and that synthesis is exactly why the X-ray machine analogy we started with fails. When you combine genetic temperaments, infantile attachment failures, severe relational trauma, and these ancient brain systems, you realize that borderline psychology, and really all diagnostic categories, are not single monolithic diseases.
They're a whole mix of things.
They're incredibly complex, multi-determined ecosystems of human survival.
It really is an ecosystem. We started this deep dive talking about that comforting, rigid binary of sane versus insane, and look at the landscape we've covered. We explored the difference between catching a symptomatic cold and living with a character-based autoimmune response.
We did.
We watched the neat linear scale break down under the weight of real human lives. We waded into the chaotic borderlands of stable instability and saw how development, trauma, and mammalian brain biology all weave together to create our internal reality.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But understanding these diagnostic evolutions helps us have more empathy for others and for our own psychological quirks. It builds empathy for the people in our lives who might be running a different survival app than we are.
It absolutely builds empathy, and it demands humility from the medical community. If our diagnostic categories are so heavily shaped by the clinical trends and limitations of their time, like the DSM narrowing the definition of borderline just because they needed something easy to measure on a clipboard, accidentally erasing the quiet borderline from existence, it leaves us with a profound question.
What's that?
What disorders of today are actually just normal, poorly categorized variations of the human experience that future psychologists will completely redefine?
That is something to think about. The murky waters of the mind are always deeper than they appear. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the boxes, and we'll catch you next time.